Good evening. My name is Deirdre Cross, and I'm the Assistant Director for Public Programs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program entitled Historically Speaking, Chuck Berry's American Life by R.J. Smith. Best known as the groundbreaking artist behind classics such as Johnny B. Goode, Maybelline, and Roll Over Beethoven, Chuck Berry was a man of contradictions whose motives and motivations remain a mystery. What we can appreciate within the context of this museum is Mr. Berry's great sense of history when he decided to donate one of the museum's earliest objects, a beautiful, brash, and iconic cherry red Cadillac so emblematic of his trailblazing life. We are very pleased to welcome Chuck Berry's author, R.J. Smith, whose first book, The Great Black Way, was a Los Angeles Times bestseller. Tonight, he discusses his latest work with Stephen Lewis, NMAAHC's curator of music and the performing arts. The two of them will later be joined by Daryl Davis, an international recording artist, actor, and writer, and leader of the Daryl Davis Band, considered to be one of the greatest blues and boogie-woogie and blues and rock and roll pianists of all times. He's played with the legendary blues band, formerly the Muddy Waters Band, and the renowned Chuck Berry. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for R.J. Smith and Stephen Lewis.
Hey, great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Very excited for our conversation this evening. Thank you, RJ.
Oh.
So I wanted to start out, ask you if you could maybe sum up Chuck Berry's impact on popular music briefly.
Wow, briefly. Yes. Well, the first thing to say is it's really great to be here. And thank you and everybody involved here at this amazing museum. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And, you know, to be in a city where Greg Tate is from and Bad Brains are from, talking about Chuck Berry, it feels really good. So, yeah, Chuck Berry, well, even beyond popular music, I would say Chuck Berry was an amazing narrative maker, not a writer, a storyteller. He saw out there this audience that was just being into existence, this teenage rock and roll audience, that when he was making music, there weren't venues full of these people. There weren't theaters hearing concerts yet. And he writes a song called Rock and Roll Music. And suddenly there is rock and roll music, and there is a rock and roll music audience. And so he willed stuff into existence before, or just as he first could see it in front of him. And he saw it before anybody else saw it, really. As a musician, well, he made the electric guitar, for sure, the heart of rock and roll. There was a saxophone, there were pianos, there always would be, and we're going to hear from a great rock and roll piano player. But Chuck put it at the core of the music, and that was Chuck. He was a singer-songwriter. He's never really kind of thought of that way, but he wrote songs about his own experience, masked, because for lots of reasons. Way before, you know, Elvis didn't write his own songs. Bob Dylan, the singer-songwriter we all have come to believe and have been told, and a great one. Chuck Berry was there before Bob Dylan. There's so many things. He, as much as anybody, is the original rock star, right at the same time as Elvis. And if you know, they were larger than life, they spoke to our lives, and there was no book they could read to figure out how to do that thing, so they invented it. Yeah, he was an inventor.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's so much in that great summary that I think, things I'd like maybe us to expand on a bit. You talked about, he creates this audience for this music, that he also creates, this rock and roll, right? And one of the things that really was very interesting to me reading the book was the way that he, sought out a way to appeal to black audiences as well as white audiences, very early on in his career. And so can you talk a little bit about how that affected, or how that is reflected in his music, how he crafted a sound that would have that universal appeal at a time when, audiences were still strictly segregated, in most of the country.
Yeah, and he never talked about how he wrote or why he wrote this or that song. And when he was writing his autobiography, the editor told me he had this amazing book full of really revealing information and stories and self-constructed myths, I think, about who he was, to tell us so much about the man. But the editor had to insist, we can't publish this unless you talk about the music. He just wouldn't. In interviews, in his own book, although there's some good stuff the editor got out of him. And so he'd like to think of himself as an inventor, making stuff. So he was a product of a lot of things in St. Louis. It's north and south. It's the gateway to the west. He was middle class in an African American part of St. Louis, but they struggled through the Depression. He had a good view on a lot of things, and he was incredibly smart, obviously an amazing writer, and he put it all into music in a way that was incredibly coded, so that if you were a Southerner, you might hear certain things. If you were a white teenager, you might hear some other things. If you were an African-American blues fan, there's other things that you're getting that other people aren't getting. And that was always the case with all his best music. And he didn't leave a trail.
So what were some of his early musical influences then?
The radio was his biggest influence. In a way, it was his first instrument, I guess. He listened to everything on the radio: jazz, rhythm and blues, Frank Sinatra. I'm about to start a job at the Country Music Hall of Fame, and he loved country music. So maybe I should try to get Chuck Berry in the Country Music Hall of Fame. But he didn't. The radio was coming into its own. The era of studio bands on the radio was fading away, so they had to fill time, and they were playing lots of records, and you couldn't tell the race or the regionality necessarily of the musician you were hearing. You just you liked it, or you liked that better, and then they were on to something else. So there was something like democracy going on the air, and from that, Chuck drew influence widely.
And, on that point, the idea of, this is kind of a pivotal moment when, radio has this new importance, particularly like the role of the disc jockey, for example, as they're using more recorded sound as opposed to live sound. And another one of those shifts that you talk about in the book is the move to electric instruments, and the idea that Chuck Berry is kind of a leader in that first generation of musicians to learn primarily on electric instruments. So what do you think the impact was of that move from acoustic music making to primarily electric music making after World War II?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there was a canon. There wasn't a body of knowledge. I mean, there were some blues guys working stuff out. There were people in their basement, taking the wires out of the walls and building their own instruments, which Chuck did, which Bo Diddley definitely did. So many of the stories of the earliest electric guitar players, those stories are about inventors, getting electrocuted and then coming up with boards with strings on them. And so there's no, what a right way and what a wrong way of doing it is just less clear. And so there was amazing, I think, freedom in that. And yeah, one of the things I came across in working on this book was a program for what almost certainly was, well, the earliest known performance by Chuck Berry. It was a variety show, for a fundraiser for some kind of group in St. Louis, and some vaudevillians were putting it on. And on the bill is playing two songs is Charles Edward Berry and his electric guitar, and it's just amazing to see. So yeah, he had the freedom of not knowing what a mistake was in a way.
So, maybe to ask a bit more of a personal question, what is your connection to Chuck Berry's music? What motivated you to, to research and write this definitive biography of Chuck Berry?
Well, one thing that I like to do as a writer is, I feel like we all talk to each other when we're talking to each other, through stuff that we make, a song, a painting, a poem, a piece of graffiti. And Chuck left us, and we fight with each other through that. We come to agreement or disagreement through the pieces of culture that we make. That's what interests me as a writer, a lot of my career. And so Chuck left us a lot of videotape, a lot of film, by which I mean his appearances on motion pictures. He left us amazing songs. He left us an amazing book. There's a lot to think about and to take apart writing about Chuck. That really interested me. Personally, I was born in 1959. That's the year Little Queenie came out, a great song. I didn't hear Little Queenie for a long time. I was 10 years old in the late 60s, and listening to AM radio in Detroit. Out there, George Clinton is making amazing music, of course, in Detroit. Amazing rock and roll. But what's on the radio that's being called rock and roll is music, by and large, or presented, I should say, as music made for people who look like me, and made by people who look like me. I thought I loved rock and roll, and I knew what rock and roll was. And I got older, and I realized there was a lot more to learn. And it was problematic because the first Chuck Berry song I was super aware of was My Ding-a-Ling. And that didn't really help me understand rock and roll so much, although it helped me understand something. But yeah, Chuck Berry, I came to understand. Chuck Berry was writing songs about people like me and lots of other people before I was born. And he was writing to people like me about who he was and his experience, if I could tune in and get what he was saying. So writing this book helped me do that, I hope.
So one of the things you referenced just a minute ago, that reality that the music that is presented as rock and roll really is, in some ways, or in a lot of ways, kind of erases the African American foundations of the music, And Chuck Berry definitely, during his lifetime, lived long enough to see those, those innovations kind of like remembered as being primarily, basically rock and roll comes to be seen as primarily a white music, by the, 80s, or even earlier. And what were his feelings on that? What were his feelings on racial appropriation and the idea that the black roots of the music had been covered over in many ways?
One more thing that Chuck would not crack about, and that to me says a lot about how much he did not like that. Or he liked people knowing who he was and loving his music. He did a pretty good job, and as his career went on, a very good job of getting paid what he deserved to get paid, or getting paid what he was able to get paid, let us say, for writing those songs and making that music. But it was never enough. And when you hear the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, however much they sit at your feet, which the British bands did, unlike many of the American bands, and sing their praises to him, my sense of who Chuck Berry was is that almost made it more painful on some level, to know what they were getting and what he was not able to get. Now, in interviews, he would say, I love it because I got a good check. And he was, most of all, going to talk about the money. And it turned into, at least in public, and I think in general in some ways, a complicated, his career became a complicated system of quid pro quo. He wasn't going to get the feeling he wanted to get. How could he ever get as much love as he deserved? He was Chuck Berry. He was able to focus and insist on the money, that he was going to make sure he got paid before anything else happened. And there are many great stories and many terrifying stories about how Chuck Berry would get paid, but he got paid. So, so he was friends with the Stones, and he punched Keith Richards out. He liked the Beatles, and I don't think he got very close with them. I think, yeah, there was a big wall between the appropriators and Chuck.
So on a different note, Deirdre mentioned when she introduced our conversation about the Cadillac Eldorado, which is not only one of the earliest objects that this museum acquired, but also one of the most iconic objects in the collection, and we're so happy to have it here. And one of the themes that runs through your book is actually car culture, and Chuck Berry's fascination with cars, and that also comes through in his music as well. And can you talk a little bit about those themes of mobility and travel and kind of I guess maybe the freedom that comes with mobility that is in his music? Your thoughts on that?
Well, and for me, the revelation starts with, it's there in the music. It starts there, but Kevin Strait, who a curator here, I don't know if he's here, but I hope to meet him in person someday. I talked to him on the phone a number of times. He was engaged in a series of conversations with Chuck about, first, I guess, getting guitars for the museum. He's Chuck Berry. We want those vintage instruments. And basically, Chuck made it clear, well, I've got something better for you that I really want you to have. That's my car. And that mattered to him profoundly and on a personal level. And he was saying that in his own way. And once my sense is, from what I've read and talked to Kevin about, is that once they were interested, Chuck starts putting up hurdles. Never heard about monetary hurdles or anything, but just complications. Oh, wait a minute, you're part of the government. I don't know if I want to give my car to the government. I just realized you're part of the, so more drama ensues. But it kind of works out, and it's never clear until one day Kevin goes out to Wentzville outside of St. Louis, and with Joe Edwards, a business associate and good friend of Chuck's, club owner in St. Louis, and it's raining, and they sit down, and Chuck sets up more hoops and hurdles, but Joe Edwards has been through all this. He's sort of the guider there in a way, and Kevin tells this great story that he tells better than I can, but about Chuck offering him an ice cream sandwich, and when somebody is offering you an ice cream sandwich when you're trying to get their car. And he's got to catch a plane. They've got a van waiting there outside the compound, and it's muddy, it's raining, and you eat the ice cream sandwich. Then he offers another ice cream sandwich. And, depending on who you talk to, there's a lot of ice cream sandwiches before the green light ensues, and they push the truck, or the Cadillac through the deflated tires. It needed some work. He had many cars. He loved cars. push it through the mud, get it onto the truck, get it in time to catch the plane or however they got it to here. Yeah, but that's, it's so amazing to see that vehicle. Well, we haven't even talked to mobility, but I'll just say it's amazing to see that vehicle underneath the mothership. It's just, there's an essay or there's a book in that. But yeah, mobility in short, it's, I mean, you know, there's echoes of the Great Migration and having the freedom to feel tied to the land or to feel imprisoned by the land, to have the freedom or the ability with wheels to, in some ways, fade into the crowd and just be a car in traffic. That's my impression. To be able to parade, to present yourself the way you want to present yourself in a bright red Cadillac. When he came to the Newport Festival in 1958, he drove an earlier bright red Cadillac with steer horns on it, I think that's right, and signs on it. He wanted to be seen, and he also wanted to fade into the traffic. Yeah, mobility. Yeah, many amazing writers have written about black mobility and the car and the Cadillac. It resonates in country music. It resonates all across pop culture, but never strongly than, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it was something that struck me because that idea of the freedom that comes with these new modes of transit, right? Like goes, you see that in the blues too, with train travel, you know. So it's really something that goes very deep in, especially the 20th century African American experience, you know, which is that idea of, you know, coming out of enslavement, having obviously very severe restrictions on movement, and then now having the ability to board a train and go somewhere else, or eventually to get behind the wheel of your car and go somewhere else, you know, it was really striking how that carries through into, you know, Chuck Berry's time, and in some ways even up to today, you could argue. But
well, you know, you're making me think.
Yeah.
Talking about Chuck envisioning this world and then inhabiting it in his music, an audience, creating the sound and then playing it. The mobility, it obviously it matters and it's huge and it resonates down to today. At the same time, late in his life, in an interview with a New York writer, he talked about how he loved to drive the Cadillac in all his cars, but when he just wanted to get around town and he didn't want to get hassled, he drove a Toyota. Chuck Berry drove a Toyota because he was going to get hassled. Mobility.
Yeah. And so if you had to, you know, kind of after, you know, all the research you've done, you know, kind of being immersed in Chuck's life and work, if you had to pick, if you had to pick a favorite performance, and then if you had to pick kind of like a definitive performance, those may be two different. What would you say?
Gosh, well, I think my favorite song is probably "Let It Rock." It's so basic and it's so kind of mysterious. It's like it seems to be about workers working on a railroad, and then it's a hot day and the train's coming and there's a teepee on the railroad tracks. No news on that. It's a teepee, and there's workers, and the train's coming. There's no bridge, I don't think, or maybe there's a bridge, but there's no verse chorus. It's just verses. And then at the end of the song, there it is. Explosion, I guess. It's just so amazing, and somehow there's a lot of America in that. Definitive performance of something. Well, The Promised Land is such an amazing song. And the idea that after he went to prison in the early 60s and came out, he was a broken man, he didn't write many songs of note, is so ridiculous. That year and a half after he came out of prison, many of his greatest songs ever, including The Promised Land, came out. And he wrote a lot of good songs after that. But The Promised Land, where he's name-checking some of the civil rights, the Freedom Summer cities, just as if he's taking a bus trip, trying to get out of the South. And then there's some static that he gets, so they're in cars, and then they fly finally in a plane to the Promised Land of California. And so it's just, depending on where you come into that song and what you want to hear in it, you can hear an awful lot about his life and about America. And it's a great song if you know a little of it or none of it or all of it.
Thank you. So at this point, I want to invite everyone in the audience to submit questions. So at the end of our conversation, we will have a Q&A with some selected questions from the audience that I'll ask to our panelists here. And at this time, I want to introduce our guest, Daryl Davis. Please join me in welcoming Daryl Davis. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. And I want to thank R.J. Smith for inviting me and the National Museum of African American History and Culture for hosting me here tonight. It's my pleasure.
Man, we're really thrilled. It's been a great conversation so far. And I wanted to start, if you would maybe tell us a little bit about your own musical background, how you started playing the piano, and just kind of, tell us a bit about your musical development.
Well, I was a late bloomer. I didn't start until I was 17 years of age in terms of learning to play music. I always liked music. But then I saw Chuck Berry, and I decided that's what I want to do. And one of the things that impressed me about him was that the fact that he had made millions upon millions of people all over the world happy with his music. He had touched them. People that he would never see, he would never meet, they would never meet him. But they heard him on the record, on the radio, saw him on TV. If they were lucky enough, they saw him in concert. I thought, that's really cool to be able to affect somebody that you don't even know that way in a positive direction. So I decided that's what I wanted to do. And so in order to play that kind of music, there was no rock and roll before Chuck Berry. So where did he get it from? What was he listening to? As R.J. pointed out, country music. Before Chuck Berry, there was big band swing. There was boogie woogie. There was the blues. So I began listening to the people that he listened to and came that way. And then, Chuck would have the promoter, whoever was hiring him, supply the band, because Chuck had stopped traveling with his own band back in the 60s. And I called a promoter and I said, I understand Chuck Berry's coming. You need to hire me to play with Chuck Berry. And I knew, that there had been concerts where bands, knew his songs, but they did not execute them the way that he wanted it done. Because Chuck Berry was a genius. As R.J. pointed out, he was a very, very smart guy. He was beyond that. He was a genius. A lot of people can say, I played the guitar, I wrote a song, other people sing my songs. But very few people can say, I invented a genre of music. Not that he would say that, because he was very humble. But he did invent a genre of music. He's probably the most influential guitarist ever. And you point out the first singer-songwriter of a genre like that. He extended the blues into something that it is today. Your typical 12-bar blues, you have 3 lines. You state your case, then you repeat it, and then you resolve it. Like, for example, take a whole lot of shaking going on. Come on over, baby, there's a whole lot of shaking going on. Then you repeat it. Come on over, baby, there's a whole lot of shaking going on. Last line, I ain't faking, whole lot of shaking going on. All right? Chuck would not repeat the first line. He would continue the song. Deep down in Louisiana, close to New Orleans, way back up in the woods among the evergreens, there stood a log cabin, on and on and on. Instead of saying deep down Louisiana, close to New Orleans, deep down Louisiana, close to New Orleans. He didn't follow the blues writing method, he followed the chord structure. And nobody had really done that before. The only song I can think of that he did follow that typical blues structure was his first song, Wee Wee Hours, which was a blues, where he repeated that line. But then he evolved out of there, and people began following that kind of thing. So I knew that Chuck was an improviser. He has never played the same song twice the same way. And I worked with Chuck for a span of 32 years. And he was my boss, he was my mentor, he was my idol, he was my friend. And my favorite song of all time is Johnny Be Good. It is the definitive rock and roll song to me. And he never played it exactly like he did in 1958. Every time we played it, it was different because he was an improviser. He played it as he felt it in the moment. And so what people would do who were going to back him up when they got the gig, they'd go out and buy Chuck Berry's greatest hits and listen to it and learn it just like the record. Well, guess what? Surprise. He doesn't play it anymore just like the record, right? If he wants to go to the bridge a second time or repeat something, that's how he's going to do it. So you have to learn how to follow him. And that's what I knew. And so this promoter had him before, and the band that they had, it was a disaster. Chuck ended up kicking half the band off the stage. And so I told him about that. I said, you don't want that to happen again. I said, I know Chuck's language. I know his body language when he plays the guitar, this, that, the other. Please give me the job. And he took a chance on me, and he did. And I had met Chuck before. I'd met him one time. I'll tell you about that in a second. But the guy gave me the job, and I backed up Chuck. Chuck was very, very happy. He told his agent whenever he was to play in the Washington metropolitan area, to have the promoter contact me. And so the agent would tell these promoters, they would call me. Eventually the agent was calling me directly, and then eventually Chuck was calling me directly. Hey, are you available on this date, that date, whatever. First time I met Chuck was in April of 1973. He was the headliner, and Jerry Lee Lewis was the opener, and it was at Coalfield House at University of Maryland. And this is before we had cell phones. And I wanted so bad to meet this man. I wasn't playing then, but I just loved his music. And it was my dream just to see him and meet him. And, it's one thing to see somebody, it's another thing to get close to them, to meet them. He was a superstar, so, there's a buffer there. I went down there, show didn't start until 8 o'clock. And I got there like somewhere right after noon. The hangar was open, and people were like bringing in speakers and lights and stuff. And the backup band that had been hired for the promoter was there. And they were all nervous. They're sitting over there by the stage. For whatever reason, they were under the impression that Chuck was going to show up at 2 o'clock. I think 2 o'clock was their sound check, that he was going to show up then for the sound check and rehearse them on the material for that evening. Little did they know that Chuck does not rehearse. And, and so they'd never worked with him before, and so they were a little nervous. And 2 o'clock rolls around, there's no Chuck. And 2:30, no Chuck. The promoter's getting nervous, and because there's no way to call him, no cell phones. And so the band went on stage and just ran through some Chuck Berry numbers, and they sounded fantastic. So around, 7:30 or so, Jerry Lee Lewis comes in with his band and goes to his dressing room, starts doing his show right on time, and still no Chuck. And Chuck was the draw. And the promoter's trying to figure out, how am I going to tell people Chuck didn't show up? I'm going to have to refund these people all this money or whatever. Well, I forgot now what time Chuck was due to go on. He's never late. He's always right on time, but he might come 10 minutes before right on time. And so anyway, he came through the backstage door. I was standing there. He came in by himself, and I had prepared everything in my mind. I was like 14 years old. I had prepared everything in my mind what I was going to say to him if I got a chance to meet him. Because I was hanging out there by the band, because I figured he'd come over where the band was. He walked right by me, and I just froze. And he walked down this hallway backstage. There's a person standing down there, and he talked to that person, and the person pointed further down to a door. And then Chuck went down to that door, and then he came back. He went back out to the parking lot, and then he came back in with his guitar. So in retrospect, what happened was, he went to get paid. And once he got paid, then he brings the guitar in. Okay? So he came over, he shook everybody's hand. I was standing there near where the band was. And the band leader says, "My name is Bruce Springsteen. I'm your band leader today." Nobody had ever heard of Bruce Springsteen at the time. And he shook everybody's hand, and Mr. Springsteen said, we thought you were going to be here at 2 o'clock, something like that. Chuck said, "No." And he said, "Okay, well, we ran through some of your songs. I think, we'll be okay. Do you know which songs you want to play?" And Chuck said, "I think I'll play some Chuck Berry songs." And that's the way it was. I mean, in the 32 years that I worked with him, he never told you what key he was going to play in. He didn't tell you what the song was going to be. And so, but it wasn't hard to figure out because he would either play a 2-bar or a 4-bar intro on his guitar by himself, and then you would come in on bar 5 or bar 3 if it was 2 bars. So he'd say and then you come in. So you got those 4 bars right there to figure out what key he's in, and then you hit it, right? But that makes people better musicians. It trains your ear, and you gotta watch him. You gotta watch him because he will cue you with his body. And if you're not watching, you'll miss the cue. So I did that for 32 years, and the thing about him is, as soon as you figure him out, and he realizes you figured him out, he changes up on you. And he might take a solo, and then halfway through the solo, he'll go, wow, and point to you, and you got to finish out the solo. And that really, really brings your musicianship up. And I've never had a better experience in my life than working with that man. And sitting on stage, listening to thousands of people out there singing his songs back to him, the chorus, "Go, Johnny, go," or "Sweet Little 16," it was just amazing.
So, in addition to your work as a musician, you also have made a really big impact as an activist as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of your work, that kind of is connected to, but also goes beyond, the work you've done as a musician and performer.
Sure. Well, Chuck Berry, in a sense, was an activist as well. Back in the day, music theaters, concert venues were segregated if they allowed black people in at all. There were ropes going around seating sections with signs hanging from them saying, white patrons only, colored seating only, just like the restrooms and the water fountains. Oftentimes, Chuck would not play in those segregated venues, but sometimes he did. But what would happen would be this: people always obeyed, the law. It was the law. If RJ and I were around in the 1950s and wanted to go see, or the 1940s, whatever, wanted to go see Sinatra, or Glenn Miller Orchestra, or Elvis Presley, or Chuck Berry, or whoever, we could not sit together. We had to sit in our seating section as designated by the color of our skin, all right? If we cross-sat, we would be arrested. That was the law, just like Rosa Parks in the bus. So the phenomenon that happened is people obeyed those laws. But when Chuck Berry and people who came after him playing that new rock and roll, and what defines a genre? There are many things that define a genre of music, but one of the aspects is the beat. And we never had this backbeat in this music before. Boom, boom, bop, boom, boom, bop, boom, boom, bop, right? It's just like his song says, just let me hear some of that rock and roll music any old way you choose it. It's got a backbeat, you can't lose it. Exactly. And that backbeat caused white kids and black kids to get up out of their seats. They couldn't sit still, knock over those signs, and they were boogieing in the aisles together for the first time in the history of this country. That would cause the police to come in and shut down those shows because they were race mixing, and that was forbidden. And so rock and roll got a bad name. It was banned in many cities, not just in the South, but even in the North, because they believed it was a communist plot, it was corrupting white youth, it was causing race mixing. And so when you think about it, we honor great people like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and many other civil rights activists, both white and black. But people like Chuck Berry and his contemporaries, Bo Diddley, Fats Domino, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, these people, when they started playing that beat that he created, causing white kids and black kids to come together, these other activists, the Kings and the Rosa Parks, et cetera, they worked hard to bring white adults and black adults together. Chuck Berry was doing it naturally through music, bringing kids together. And understand something, these kids who danced together, these black kids and white kids, they did not know each other. Why? Because in the 50s, they didn't go to school together. Schools were segregated. So the power of that music. And that is something that inspired me as well. And so one time I was playing that kind of music in a place called Frederick, Maryland, in a bar that was an all-white bar known as the Silver Dollar Lounge. There were no signs saying whites only, anything like that, but it had that kind of reputation that blacks were not welcome. Well, here I was in there, and I was playing country music and rockabilly and whatever else. And so at the end of the set, I was going to take a seat, and I was the only black person in there. A gentleman came up from behind and put his arm around my shoulder and said, "I really love your piano playing. This is the first time I ever heard a black man play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis." And I wasn't offended, but I was rather surprised, given the fact that this guy was probably 15 to 20 years older than me, did not know the black origin of Jerry Lee's music. And I began to explain that Jerry Lee got it from the same place I did, black, blues, and boogie-woogie piano players, right? And he didn't believe that either. I said, "Look, man, I know Jerry Lee Lewis. He's a good friend of mine. He's told me that himself." He didn't believe that either. But he wanted me to go back to his table and let him buy me a drink. I had a cranberry juice, and then he took his glass and clinked my glass and cheered me. And then he says, "You know, this is the first time I ever sat down and had a drink with a black man." Now I'm baffled, like, how can this be? And I innocently asked him why. Long story short, he told me he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So that began my, my activism career. I began sitting down with him. I arranged for him to introduce me to other people, and I wrote a book on the Klan by traveling all over the country, interviewing Klan leaders and Klan members. And many of them ended up becoming good friends of mine, giving me their robes and hoods and renouncing that ideology. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. So we have some questions from the audience, both here in person and online. Our first question is from Kevin Strait.
Maybe he can tell us how many ice cream sandwiches it was.
So Kevin wants to know, how did Chuck Berry influence the guitar riffs of the late 60s and 70s?
How do you influence who?
The guitar riffs.
Oh, you want to answer that?
I would love to hear what you...
Okay, well, most guitar players prior to Chuck Berry in blues and in other genres of music would play single lines, like a Charlie Christian, a B.B. King, all right? Les Paul would play some double stops or double harmony lines. Chuck Berry played double stops. Instead of playing single notes, he would double them up, play like mini chords as his, when I say mini, M-I-N-I, chords as his lead. And that was one of the biggest differences between the blues and rock and roll. You take somebody like T-Bone Walker or Carl Hogan, who were guitarists who influenced Chuck Berry. In fact, they even played some of the same riffs. And if you listen to some of Chuck's riffs, it's the same thing that came before him by T-Bone Walker or Carl Hogan, except Chuck had doubled it up.
Thank you. So this is a question for you, RJ. In your research, did you uncover any lesser-known aspects of Chuck Berry's life or music that surprised you?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I interviewed over 100 people, and, you know, finding that program of his first public appearance was fascinating to me. You know, I guess just having a sense of how at risk he put himself in those early shows, where he would also, at the end of the show, they'd have a big number at the end, and he would invite all the people in the audience on the white side and the black side to come, and it was an innocent gesture, but it was a pointed gesture too, to thumb his nose at the law,
right,
and bring everybody on the stage and dance together. And he would say, "Well, I just was being friendly," and then he would, you know. But there were plenty of times when gestures like that, or interpersonal gestures that had a political or had a complicated social aspect to Chuck Berry, I think, that could have put his life at risk.
Well, you know, he did put his life at risk one time, a little-known incident. He was in, like, I think it was Philadelphia, Meridian, Mississippi.
Oh, yeah.
And a white girl came up on stage, danced or whatever, and gave him a hug. And he got arrested that night for that. And he got taken to the local jail where the deputy sheriff fined him and took money out of his wallet and kept it and said that, oh, well, that's the fine, the whole amount in his wallet. That was in the late 50s or something. Well, you all know what happened in 1964 in Philadelphia, Meridian, Mississippi, with 3 civil rights workers who were murdered by the sheriff and his deputy. Same police precinct.
So we have another question from our virtual audience, and this is for both of y'all. How do you think legal issues and other kind of notable controversies complicate how the public remembers Chuck?
Well, it certainly complicates it, and I think it makes this is a time so many artists who we admire, whether they're great writers, great architects, great composers, actors. There are allegations and stories and believable testimony about their private lives. And it's important that this be talked about and examined. And it's important, if ambiguous, for everyone who is touched by that art to think and to deal with it on their own. I kind of went into this book wanting to talk about that, and I did in Chuck's not anybody else's, but Chuck's story of some of these events, and it just is so obvious that I would not want to live in a world without Chuck Berry's music, but I also know some people feel otherwise, and I respect that, and I think it's important to let people have their own experience and to value that and respect that. I think Chuck Berry in some ways was fortunate in that some of the things that the videotapes and the private tapes, some of which were recorded without the women's being acknowledgement, and some of which was consensual, that seems to have largely taken place before the era of the internet. And I can't help but think we would be having different conversations about Chuck if that had flooded the internet years later. It would not have made him any less of a great artist, however. So that's a simple answer. We can talk about it at length. With the earlier jail, the prison time in the early 60s, he crossed the country with a Native American 14-year-old girl. And he was tried and found guilty of the Mann Act, which is a ridiculous law, still different, but still on the books as a felony, that is a racist law meant to prosecute black men who were having sex with white women, and they made it a felony so that if you cross state lines to have sex, so they were confused, the first judge in this trial, because this wasn't a white woman, this was a Native American girl, and they didn't really care about her at all. I mean, she actually, in some ways, she certainly suffered probably more in her life for what happened to her there, I suspect, still alive, as far as I can tell, than Chuck did. But so something hard to forgive happened, but he was prosecuted for something that is absurd and racist.
To give a little bit more context about the Mann Act, also, I think Jack Johnson was also prosecuted, so again, to emphasize sort of.
Surprisingly, and I'm not saying, I can tell you this. Yes, she did come to St. Louis. He gave her a job in his club. She was stealing money, and he was going to send her back to where she came, where he got her. But she stayed in St. Louis and was prostituting. She was picked up by the police, and they would say, how did you get here? Chuck Berry. Well, he had several things going against him. A, he was black. B, he was playing a type of music that was not accepted by the establishment. And here is this girl who looks white. She's a Apache girl, all right? There was never any proof in the courtroom that the act actually took place. In fact, in the first trial, it was a mistrial because the judge had called him by the N-word in the courtroom, so they had to retry it.
Right.
So that sets the tone of what's happening. But regardless, Chuck did not physically bring her to St. Louis. I know the person who physically brought her to St. Louis. He's been in my house and sat there and told me the story, but I'm not going to go into all that. But speaking of Mann Act, somebody driving somebody from New Mexico to Missouri, who she said she was 21, but you know how that works. But we do know somebody who was 14 and didn't cross state lines, but crossed the Atlantic Ocean and slept in a rock star's bed for 7 years. And then she went from being Priscilla Beaulieu to Priscilla Presley. Where was the Mann Act then? Where was the Mann Act when Jerry Lee Lewis was trotting around the country with his 13-year-old cousin, who he later married? I'm not knocking those people. I'm just asking. So these are some things that have to be considered. One wrong does not deserve another wrong, okay, by any means.
Thank you. And so, are there any current artists, this is another question from our audience, are there any current artists that you feel are heavily influenced by Chuck? If so, what do you think Chuck's thoughts on them would be?
What was the last part?
What do you think Chuck would think of them?
Well, I being from Detroit, maybe, I've always thought that there was such a simpatico, so many musicians, Iggy and the Stooges, the MC5, Bob Seger, making tributes, literal tributes and musical tributes to Chuck Berry. And I can't help but think Jack White and the White Stripes, and things that Jack White has done since the White Stripes, are often and interestingly in the tradition, both as storytelling and guitar music, in the Chuck Berry tradition. I don't know what he would think of them, and I don't think he would think much of them. I did that first, he would say, and he would be right.
Well, you mentioned Little Queenie earlier. T-Rex, who did the song Bang a Gong, was taken from Little Queenie. And at the very end of the song, you hear him say, "Meanwhile, I was thinking," right? The song Keep Your Hands to Yourself, the Georgia Satellites, that's straight up Chuck Berry. I mean, anybody who plays rock, I don't care if it's the Beatles, the Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Elton John, Ted Nugent, Eddie Van Halen, anybody who plays rock, all of their DNA goes back to Chuck Berry. It's like no matter what kind of car you drive, whether it's a Rolls Royce or a Tesla or a beat-up Chevrolet, it all goes back to Henry Ford and his Model A and his Model T. So Chuck Berry was the Henry Ford of rock music. It evolved from there, along with some of his contemporaries as well. Jesse McReynolds, who was a great and famous bluegrass artist, just passed away. And he and his brother, Jim and Jesse, were a great bluegrass duo and had a band, Jim and Jesse and the Virginia Boys. They did a whole bluegrass album back in the 60s called Berry Picking in the Country. It was all Chuck Berry. Johnny B. Good, Maybelline, Sweet Little 16, Memphis, all done bluegrass style. And Chuck Berry wrote the liner notes to that album. He loved it, because one thing he loves about that is because, he liked people. Whether he liked somebody else's music or not, he liked the idea of them doing his songs because he got paid. And that's business. That's being commercial. He wanted to make money. He wanted to make a living doing it. So the more people that record your songs, the more money you make. Think about, everybody associates Blue Suede Shoes with Elvis Presley. Elvis didn't write it. Carl Perkins wrote the song. Carl Perkins made a ton of money off Elvis doing it. Everybody associates I Will Always Love You with Whitney Houston. She didn't write it. Dolly Parton wrote it. Dolly Parton's not mad that Whitney Houston did it. She made a ton of money.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. How did Chuck Berry's music evolve over time, and did he adapt to changes in the music industry?
Well, I'll jump in, and then I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like over time, from the 70s on maybe, he invested more and more of his creative energy and just creativity in his live performances. And the records weren't selling as well as they used to. I don't think some of those records mattered to him as much as some of the earlier ones did. And I think as well that he felt that there was more money in making more Chuck Berry sounding music than writing new kinds of songs that he could have written and dealing with new issues and new stories to tell. I feel like he lost interest maybe in writing those kind of records, because those kind of records weren't hits on the pop charts anymore. So he focused more on live performance. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. He did put out some newer material in '79 on a record called Rocket, great songs, and of course the record that was released posthumously, just called Chuck, had a lot of great songs on there that he wrote. But yeah, there was a lull in time that he did not do a lot of public writing of those songs. He might have written them at home and recorded them in his home studio and things like that. But when I would play with him, we would do, people always want to hear the hits. They want to hear Maybelline, Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven, Carol, Nadine, My Ding-a-Ling, Sweet Little 16, whatever. It was sort of like when Paul McCartney and the Beatles broke up and Paul McCartney put together his new band called Wings. People kept screaming for I Saw Her Standing There and all these other Beatles songs, and he didn't want to do them. The song Garden Party by Ricky Nelson. Ricky Nelson became Rick Nelson, and they had a rock and roll revival at Madison Square Garden where they had a bunch of the 50s acts, and Ricky Nelson was on there, and people kept calling for Traveling Man and Hello, Mary Lou and all that kind of stuff, and he wasn't doing them, and he got booed, and that's why he wrote Garden Party about Madison Square Garden. So if you're constantly putting out new music, and that's what you're known for, like a Stevie Wonder, or a Ray Charles, or somebody like that, then that's expected. But when people, come to see you for your 1950s hits, they still want to hear them, in 1980 or 1990 or 2000, and some of them can tend to get a little, upset. I saw Elvis many, many times, and people, would scream out Jailhouse Rock and scream out songs from the 50s. He might do a verse or two of them, but that was it. He was doing, later songs, the Las Vegas years and all that, which were great too. I mean, the man had a phenomenal voice. He was a phenomenal performer. But people tend to get upset if they want to hear something, they pay that money to come see you, and you're not doing your hits. Because I asked Chuck one time, hey, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? Nah, they won't like that. But we would do some of the country songs that he liked. He recorded Jambalaya by Hank Williams, Crazy Arms, Fräulein. One of his favorite songs, he asked me if I could find it for him one time. It was by a country group called the Louvin Brothers. It was called Knoxville Girl. And it was a very morbid song. But anyway, I got him the Louvin Brothers' greatest hits or whatever with Knoxville Girl on it, and gave it to him. He was heavily, heavily influenced by different forms of music. One of his favorite artists was Nat King Cole. And one time, I picked him up at the airport. I was one of the very few people that he would let drive him. Chuck would usually fly in and rent a car and then drive himself to the hotel, drive himself to the gig or whatever. Only other person besides me or his family or something like that that would drive him would be his bass player, Jimmy Marsala, very great friend of mine. He wanted to be in control of where he goes. He can leave when he wants to leave. Because I remember one time he was coming here to D.C. and we were going to work together. And it was the first time I drove him. I called him and I said, hey, I'll meet you at the airport. He said, okay, great. So I go to the airport, I meet him, and this whole crowd is there. trying to get autographs. They bring guitars and all kinds of stuff, pictures. And so he'll sign a few of them. And one guy gave him a book, a jazz and blues pictorial book, and gave it to Chuck. And so we're walking, and Chuck starts walking towards the rental car place. And I said, no, come ride with me. That's why I'm here. He goes, no, I need to rent my rental car. I said, well, I got a car. You just ride with me. And, I can take you wherever you want to go. If you want to drive my car, you can drive my car. He looked at me, he goes, Daryl, you're breaking my stride. I'd never heard that expression before, but I knew exactly what it meant. But then he laughed and he rode with me. And I drove him to the hotel, and it was over here in Alexandria, or Crystal City. And we sat in his room, in his big suite, and we're going through this book that this guy gave him. All these jazz and blues artists. He knew every one of them. But the ones he was most fascinated with were the older ones than him. Sinatra and Nat King Cole and Count Basie and all this. And he just looked at, but his favorite was Nat King Cole. And a lot of people revere Chuck Berry. I've been with him when Barbra Streisand came over to the table, or other artists, and they just humbled themselves in front of him, And you think, wow, these are superstars humbling in front of Chuck Berry, because he was a superstar to them. And then I asked him, he kept talking about Nat King Cole and kept looking at the pictures of Nat King Cole in the book. And I said, did you ever meet him? He goes, almost. I was afraid to. And that really put a human aspect on him. I said, what happened? He said, well, we were playing in the same city and staying in the same hotel, and I was coming down the sidewalk, going back to the hotel, and Nat was coming up the sidewalk, and I was too afraid to say hello to him. Same way I froze when I first saw him. Chuck had that same feeling when he saw Nat King Cole, and that really put it in perspective for me.
Well, thank you both. This has been an amazing conversation. Everyone, please join me in thanking Daryl Davis.
Thank you.
R.J. Smith.
Thank you.
There are books that will be available in the lobby for sale, book signing, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Just a note about the book sale, you'll have to actually enter the shop because the Wi-Fi is a little uneven upstairs tonight, and then we'll move RJ out to the outside the shop at the table in Heritage Hall for you to do this, for him to sign your books. So thank you.